You have joined today's session on centering the community and resilience planning. My name is Diana Toledo. I am one of the coordinators for the Urban Waters Learning Network, which is the sponsor for today's webinar. And if you're unfamiliar with the Learning Network, we are an initiative that is coordinated by two organizations, my own River Network and Groundwork USA, with financial support from EPA. And in essence, we're a peer-to-peer network of people and organizations that are working to restore and revitalize urban waterways and the communities that surround them. This year, the Urban Waters Learning Network is focusing on providing support to practitioners to help them build community and climate resilience. It's been a topic that's been of great interest to our network members. And so we're doing a number of sessions. Today is the second webinar session we are offering on this topic, on how can the community build resilience, both through education, through mitigation, through planning. And I will make references later to some of the resources that we have on our website, including the recording from the first session that we did on integrating climate change education into your work. So today's session is going to focus on resilience planning and ensuring that such planning efforts really center the community, with the goal being that we're working in our communities not only to develop and build climate resilience, but also community resilience, and addressing the needs of the community that are broader than just the environmental needs, but are interrelated needs with climate change. Just a heads up, and I'll share more info at the end of the session. Next month, we're going to host the third session on this series. It's called After the Storm, Equitable Recovery and Resilient Adaptation, and we're going to hear examples and lessons from New Orleans on what happens after the storm. So just as we're getting started, I want to just get a little bit of sense of who is in the room. And so I'm going to launch a couple of polls. And this is the first poll. Can you let us know, to what extent has your community developed any sort of climate resilience plan? Whether you know, you may not be aware if that's the case, but would love to get a sense of whether or not, to what extent do you know, and whether or not your community has developed any sort of climate resilience plan. Okay, there's a few folks still. Okay, I'm going to give it about 3 more seconds. 2, 1. Let's go ahead and close the poll. And you can see about 1/3 of you answered yes, your community has developed a climate resilience plan. 42% of you said no, and 1/4 of you are not sure. Okay, that's very helpful. Let me ask a second question. To the extent that there are local initiatives to promote resilience, to what extent are they either informed or driven by the priorities of community members? So how, you can think about how are community members engaged in setting the priorities and the desired outcomes of any local adaptation initiative. Okay, I'm going to give it a couple more seconds for folks to respond. And sometimes these show up in climate mitigation or adaptation plans, and sometimes they're just resilience goals that are embedded within other planning efforts in our communities. So I'm trying to keep that sort of general. Okay, I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results of that. So 20% of you answered yes. Local adaptation initiatives are largely informed by community priorities. 30% of you say moderately, so about half of you overall, yes, your communities are leaning into the community to identify those priorities. About 40% of you say no, not really. So that's an interesting breakout. Almost half of you are working in communities where adaptation initiatives are not to any great extent or any extent really informed by the community. Okay, so this is great. Thank you so much for sharing. So this is the goal of today's session, is to learn more about how we can center community in resilience planning, and then learn about an example, a case study in New Jersey of how one organization is working to ensure that the community really is at the driver's seat, or at least at the table in shaping those kinds of plans. So with that, I'm super excited to have these two speakers. We have a good number of members in our learning network that are engaging in various efforts around resilience planning. And I'm so excited that Drew Curtis, and we'll introduce him here in a second, has stepped up to share his experience working in New Jersey. And are super excited to have Corrine Van Hook also presenting today, who is going to share wonderful resources that guide some of the thinking of how we can center communities. So with that, let me turn it over to Renee Mazurek, one of my colleagues at the Urban Waters Learning Network, so she can introduce both of our presenters today. Renee, do you want to take it away?
Thanks, Gianna. I'm happy to introduce our presenters today, Corrine Van Hook-Turner and Drew Curtis. At the Movement Strategy Center, Corrine works as a program manager for the Transitions in Place team, where she bridges disconnected and under-resourced movements together for greater sustained impact. Corrine has been deeply immersed in movements for social, economic, and racial equity all her life, and professionally for about 15 years and counting. She witnesses the compelling impact of investing in youth and disenfranchised communities of color so that leadership can reflect the real diversity it seeks to serve. She currently serves on steering committees for Rooted in Resilience, the California Trade Justice Coalition, and the Resilient Oakland Initiative. Drew Curtis has served at Ironbound Community Corporation for the past 9 years as Senior Equitable Development Manager, working on community organizing, public policy advocacy, neighborhood planning and revitalization, urban agriculture, economic empowerment and development, and affordable housing initiatives. All this work is grounded in principles of justice and equity. He also sits on the board of the Essex Community Land Trust, which has the mission of keeping housing perpetually affordable. So many thanks to our presenters, and I look forward to hearing your presentations today.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and make you a presenter, Corrine. Please, everybody, go ahead and type your questions into the questions box. Over the course of the presentations, Renee and I will both be looking into those and tracking what questions come in. So with that, Corrine, you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, I just, it's telling me to reload.
Yeah, we're seeing that. Yes.
Okay, and now it says loaded.
Like loaded. Okay, let's give it a second. Corrine,
Okay.
if you're having trouble, I can also, I have access to your presentation and can also show
Yes.
it
Good thing is a backup. That's actually quite odd because everything on my end has been working fine, so I'm not understanding why it's not, but. Maybe if you want to try. It's still loading on my end.
Okay. Let me go ahead and pull this back up. I'll take the control back then, and I'll go ahead and start the slideshow. Can you see it from here?
Yes.
Yeah. So why don't you just give me a heads
Okay.
up and I can keep advancing the slides.
Okay, you can go ahead and advance the slide. This was just the first slide. All right. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Great to be on this webinar with all of you, and really just excited that peer learning networks like this and others exist. So really honored to be here to share with you all some of our work. As mentioned, my name is Corrine Van Hook-Turner, and I am the Transitions in Place Program Manager for Movement Strategy Center. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Movement Strategy Center, we're a nonprofit organization, also a fiscal sponsor of about 20 projects. And we work to support people, grassroots orgs, alliances, networks, funders, oftentimes in a partner and advising capacity, to really kind of think and vision about what does it mean to build leadership and relationships necessary for powerful and transformative social justice movements now, even if the circumstances don't allow for it, right? So how can we always think along an arc of transformation in the actions that we can take toward actually realizing that 10, 20, 30, and 50 and 100 years down the line. Slide. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Oh, there it's moving. Okay, great. So one of the big inquiries that Movement Strategy Center centers in the approach to our work, whether it be our Innovation Center who supports our fiscally sponsored projects, or actually the programmatic work that we do of our own, specifically myself, around community-driven climate resilience planning. We try to do it from a place of the inquiry of like, how are we actually leading a transition from our existing world of domination and extraction to a world of regeneration, resilience, and interdependence as a grounding place for us to actually envision what's possible. Next slide, please.
I think there might be a delay.
Got it. Yeah, yeah, maybe on my end. Oh, yeah, there we go. So these are just, these are just some of our programs, as I mentioned: Transitions in Place, Innovation Center, Restorative Economy, Youth and Intergenerational Organizing, and our Community Climate Solutions. Next slide. So I just wanted to kind of ground you all kind of in our organization and the work that we do. Again, like there are resources to kind of learn more. I encourage you all to, when you get a moment, take a further look, given that we have a short time today. One of the things, given that this is really about how are we actually centering community in climate resilience planning and community-driven planning, one of the things that I like to do in having a conversation, and that's really important just in planning in general, especially when bringing together folks from different places and different sectors, is really being able to kind of come to an understanding of like, are we speaking the same language? Not just ethnically, right, in terms of like where we're from, but actually like understanding and being on the same page to kind of open up like shared understanding, shared learning, shared solutions. So the question is like, I like to ground in is, what is climate resilience? How are we defining that? And I'd like to offer, next slide, is that resilience is all different components of adaptation, mitigation, social cohesion, and equity. Oftentimes, you may, and I certainly have experienced resilience described in different forms, sometimes even siloed if you look at all of these different components separately, or kind of like maybe a heavy, focus on one versus the other, where actually we'd like to invite you thinking about it in a comprehensive way to inform comprehensive visioning and solutions for issues, because oftentimes, complex issues also require complex solutions. So adaptation, mitigation, social cohesion, and in capital letters, I always like to say equity, right? Like, and we say equity so much, we throw it around, but really being able to define, how are we actually solving, historical, brown, indigenous, disabled, gender, all of those folks that have been oppressed for so many years, and oftentimes bear the brunt of not just impact socially, economically, and environmentally, but now that we're dealing with such, exacerbating such impacts such as climate, which are exacerbated for these communities far worse, right? So how are we solving for them in a way that would allow us to solve for everyone? Next slide, please. So one of the resources that you see in the handout section is our community-driven climate resilience planning framework. We launched that back in 2017, and it was created kind of through a convening back in earlier conversations, 2014. One of my former organizations that I co-directed, Rooted in Resilience, is actually highlighted here in terms of other amazing organizations, both in the Bay Area here where I'm from, and also nationally, that are actually sharing like case studies and tools of like, what does it look like? What does it mean to do this work? And how can we kind of create this learning and maybe share and scale up kind of some of these solutions? So I really just wanted to kind of share a little bit about this framework and how now we're at a point where we're really kind of using it to, much like this network for this webinar, building an ongoing community of practice of peer learning network called the NACRP, which stands for National Association of Climate Resilience Planners. Next slide. So, you know, what is community-driven planning and why is it important? Well, we like to offer that, you know, it builds leadership outside of local government agencies. It offers the opportunity to increase collaboration and capacity, right? Like how many of you, wherever you are, and particularly this has been my experience with agencies in government, like we just don't have capacity, we don't have the staff to work on this. And oftentimes, and unfortunately, it's the engagement side of things that often is the least invested, right? So that's where it's really helpful. And then it also allows for advancing a multi-sectoral approach to, again, like I said, allow for more holistic and effective solutions. Next slide. So some of the priorities that we like to kind of offer and employ in kind of this community-driven planning approach, right, is that we're promoting those solutions driven by community as a way to, again, as we said, solving for those that are experiencing the worst of the impacts and centering their leadership, right, those frontline communities. Actually, by doing this, we're ensuring climate solutions actually meet the real needs of those communities. At the same time, we're also increasing the capacity for whole systems thinking, right? You know, the human-centered approaches, as well as the technical. And then that allows us to kind of like have a priority of fostering opportunities for alignment, right? How can we actually look at kind of the multiple areas of expertise to, again, do some shared visioning together and co-create solutions that align? Next slide. So again, like I said, once you get time, the framework will go over all of what I am about to go over briefly today in much more detail. This, you'll notice in our framework, is called kind of our 7 components of community-driven planning. We explain it as our web of community-driven planning, and we like to say that, you know, an actual healthy and effective model actually includes all of these things working together, right? Co-development of a planning model, right, with all stakeholders at the table that are truly reflective of a place. Power building, I'll get into that in a moment more deeply. Visioning, I'll also get into that more deeply. Problem definition, community assessment, solutions development, which I'll also talk about more specifically, and also interventions to keep public planning processes on track. Next slide. So you just saw our web. And within our web, really, really core to that, we call the engine of climate resilience planning. And again, like I said, feel free to read further and see many amazing spotlights and examples in our framework. The reason why I wanted to focus on this today is because this is at the core, aside from the web, this is at the core of like what we say should always be happening in motion through all planning processes, from planning to implementation to assessing any kind of you know, anything along the way. And so that is vision, power building, and solutions development. Next slide. So the reason why visioning is so important, again, like kind of how we did the exercise of like, what is community resilience, is really being able to say like, what is the issue that we're tackling at hand, right? How are we defining the goal? We're wanting to make sure also, right, that it's community derived, like, okay, who are we solving for? Do we have everyone at the table? Are all of, you know, the issues that we're dealing with exclusive, or are they, you know, incorporating all the communities that are impacted first and worse? Are we visioning about, like, you know, solutions that can actually inspire beyond just the actual work that we're doing as part of a specific plan, can actually have the sustainability to inform and strengthen social cohesion in a place? And also, like, how can that visioning motivate engagement for the work ahead? Oh, go ahead. Next slide. Perfect timing. Power building. So we kind of define power building as, again, like, as you see, investing in both people and systems. The reason why I say that is because oftentimes I'll be in a room and I'll ask folks, you know, how many of you would define power building as, you know, things that happen within grassroots organizations or community organizations specific to campaigns or policy wins, or, you know, things like that. And sometimes I get a lot of hands. Though I'll get a few that also understand power building to actually happen within a government or agency context, that it can actually happen, you know, both external and internally, you know. So how are we actually making sure that we are building power toward a same shared goal together, right? So that we can actually have greater impact. And in that way, that it increases self-governance. It increases, oh, that's fine. No, that's fine. That's fine. You all have the slide.
Sorry about that. Ready to slide?
No, it's okay. It's okay. Yes, that's fine. If there's questions later, I can always cover, and you all have the slide to look at. Okay, so this is my, of the engine, solutions development, I always say, is my favorite. This image that you see here is called Two Paths Up the Mountain. The reason why, for me, it's my favorite, and also I think that it's really critical and important, is because it visions along kind of a simultaneous pathway of, like, we have to actually be building systems change while we are kind of navigating and building new infrastructure. Those things are often needing to happen at the same time, because one of the things that we notice is that when they don't, that there's a lot of silos, there's a lot of gaps. We're not solving comprehensively for everyone, right? So again, like, this encompasses a multi-stakeholder, community-driven planning approach by doing kind of the solutions development in this way. And as you'll see in the center of the image, you know, you have the different stakeholders, just to give an example. Next slide. So when we put together this framework with a lot of the amazing leaders that you'll see featured in it, we were able to kind of distill down to 5 principles of community-driven climate resilience planning. And the first one is whole systems thinking, desired outcomes reflected in every step, right? That, like, incremental change is really, really important. Planning processes is learning processes, right? How are we actually planning and doing our work along an arc of incremental change as opposed to linear way, or you know, in just a different way than linear, because we can actually get further by kind of making small adjustments along the way, rather than just kind of full force, and then at the end of it, we really kind of lost sight of what we were solving for. Planning into action, and also really, really important to also do along the way, is balancing power dynamics among stakeholders, because in a lot of this type of work, especially when it comes to money, investment, political power, balancing the power dynamics are really, really important, especially for those community members that often don't have a voice. Next slide. So like I said, I'm really excited that I am able to kind of share at this peer learning network, because one of the ways in which we are going to continue to build this community of practice rooted in the framework approach is through our National Association of Climate Resilience Planners, NACRP for short. And so that is an emerging multi-stakeholder peer learning resource and referral network that will foster effective place-based climate resilience planning and implementation. And so I certainly encourage you all to kind of go to the website, where you can also see this, see this framework and download it in case you missed the opportunity, as well as, you know, learn more information about the emerging network and keep staying up to date about how you can either be a part of it or kind of reference it in some way. And we've broken it up is that it is a member-driven, like, grassroots member-driven network that also has, facilitators and partners. Facilitators who are actually grounded in this framework approach, often allowing for this type of planning, and then partners, right, which could be government folks, educational institutions, and funders. Next slide. So the example that I wanted to share with you all today, now that we've kind of like gone over, okay, what are some of like the elements of, what we think about community-driven climate resilience planning is, right, and does. How does it actually look in action? And so one of the examples that I'm going to share with you today, which I was trying to figure out many, but I'm like, well, let's look at water. Is a local example here in California for the city of Marin. It's called the Marin People's Plan. And so the purpose of this video, which I'm about to show, is that it's going to really highlight this effort that was kind of called together to solve challenges such as flooding in a particular location that really draws on and highlights the importance of community expertise. Having a people's plan such as this is really relevant to communities, especially who have not regularly participated in municipal general or specific planning due to structural discrimination, oppression. And so you'll see that strategies might include solutions from housing, infrastructure, landscape management, and land use in general. And so given the impacts that, again, for communities of color and all impacted frontline communities that are hit first and worst, people's plans will be more and more focused on addressing, again, risk resilience, including, excuse me, sea level rise, extreme storm events, again, that have a relationship to affordable housing and the lack of economic opportunity and investment, and also mobility. And so for the Marin's People's Plan, they really did take a permacultural design approach, which for those of you who are not familiar with permaculture, it's an ecological design system that's actually rooted in indigenous wisdom, and it allows for elevating kind of ecosystem knowledge while also meeting human needs. So actually, how are we stacking functions, understanding kind of the diversity of like a place. And then they used watershed as the unit of design of intervention. So before I play the video, just because I don't want to assume knowledge of Marin City, I just want to kind of give a little bit of background of the city itself. It's within the Richardson Bay watershed of Marin County Flood Control District 3. It has a steep watershed in the hills of Marin Headlands, and on one side, and then developed areas in Highway 101 on the Richardson Bay on the other. And so Marin City, it chronically floods, right? So the stormwater infrastructure and the local drainage facilities, including pipes, ditches, they're not sized adequately to like convey flashy hillside runoff. And so this stormwater carries high sediment or mud, which actually can heavily impact local businesses and homeowners. Extreme events can actually inundate the Highway 101, and this can cause regional transportation breakdowns on only one road, and then a major commuter corridor, which actually connects Marin City to the rest of the county and San Francisco. So of greater impact locally, though, the one road in and out of Marin City, Donahue Street, is regularly flooded, and it's closed more frequently. So like managing things like stormwater in the uplands and sanitation breakages, downstream, actually further contribute to the local hazards. So if you could go ahead and play, and this is again, like this is showcasing, this actual, given this impact, like Marin City, these folks coming together to create a people's plan.
I'm having Renee share the video because it didn't come through on the slides you shared with me. So she's going to go ahead and play it off the YouTube.
Okay, sounds good. And you'll see Pandora Thomas, who is a fellow of Movement Strategy Center and also my colleague who is engaged in this work.
All right, go ahead, Renee. I hope the sound comes through. I'm afraid the sound is not coming through.
Is it not?
No.
Okay.
Corrine, you don't have it as an MP3 off your computer, do you?
I actually do. Let me, it was just,
Apologies, folks, for this glitch.
yeah. I do have it. So if you want to give me control, I can play it. This is the last thing for my presentation. So, and I really would love to show it. It will really give the insight into actually how are we doing this work. Okay.
One thing.
Corrine, I'm afraid it's not, something is happening. It's not coming clearly. Corrine, I don't know that we're going to be able to share it. Corrine, are there some highlights from the video that you might be able to talk through? Because I'm afraid that it's not coming through on the sound. Any highlights that you want to share?
Yeah, I think that, you know, basically,
how would this rank about travel?
Do you want me to hear? Let me stop it because I think it's going to continue to play if I don't, or kind of go in and out. I don't know if you all do kind of I can, and this is a shorter video, so I don't know if you share things after this webinar, but I'm happy to, or if you all want to kind of share this afterwards.
Yes, everybody will receive an automated email.
But basically, these, right. But basically, again, given the context that I gave you around Marin City, you know, Marin County is a very wealthy. It's one of the wealthiest cities, right? And so, you know, Marin City, unfortunately, aside from Marin County, is really, again, like this marginalized community that has really experienced a large amount of disinvestment, and communities have not, like the residents there, again, this is highlighting the importance of really using and honing in on community expertise and as actually essential to doing planning that will allow for actually building resilience in that social cohesion. And so these both community residents, along with my colleague Pandora Thomas from Earthseed Consulting, she's also a Movement Strategy Center fellow, and some local residents in Marin City actually kind of came together to co-create a people's plan. And I gave you kind of background like on a people's plan, right? Which is that, you know, it's really about how are we actually solving for these set of challenges. And for this particular city, it was around the flooding issues that they were experiencing. And they've been able to be really, really successful in terms of identifying ways in which they're investing in planning, you know, funding sources, like looking at regional flood control districts as like sources of investment to continue this work, community foundations, the SF Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and really just bringing together multi-stakeholders that are actually driven by a community of expertise to do planning and actually create a plan for that place. That is planning in advance, right? Which is essential, right? So that when these kind of impacts of climate kind of hit us, we're able to not just bounce back, which is kind of a resilience framing that, you know, oftentimes we hear, but actually thrive and kind of have a strength-based approach, particularly for those most impacted. So with that, I'm sorry that the video didn't play well. There's some amazing folks in there that could, of course, tell the story, which I think stories are really important, much better than I could.
Thank you so much, Corrine. As we've been typing into the chat box, we'll be sure to include that YouTube link onto the email that everybody will receive this afternoon. That'll also include a link to the session if you want to share it with others in your organization.
Okay.
So, Thank you again for that story. With that, I want to turn it over to Drew Curtis to help us understand a little bit about the story of what this centering community looks like in Newark, New Jersey, and the Ironbound community. Drew, you want to take it away?
Sure. Good afternoon, or I guess good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Can everybody see my screen?
I think so. Yep.
Cool. Just wanted to check. First, thank you to River Network for inviting me to present, and thanks, Corrine, for that great kind of framing, because it's what you described is a lot of what our approach is to Ironbound Community Corporation. We're a multi-service community-based organization. We've been around since 1969, so we're in our 50th year, and we're really rooted in ground-up change too. I didn't fix the years. We're at 50 years now too, but those are some of the different services that we get to offer. And the Ironbound community makes up most of the East Ward of Newark. And it's called Ironbound because we're literally bound in by rail with freight or resident or commercial Amtrak corridor rail lines on all sides of our neighborhood too. It's an immigrant community, that first stop from immigrants, which today is mostly South and Central America, with Brazil and Ecuador as the largest two countries of origins for folks in our neighborhood. We have the largest concentration of undocumented individuals in the state of New Jersey, and we also have a significant Black population too that largely resides in public housing or publicly subsidized housing. And we're starting to see the beginnings of gentrification in our neighborhood too. It's a hot market as the PATH train, which comes out of New York City, other stops closer to New York City gentrify, then it puts more pressure on our market. We're also an environmental justice community with the largest Superfund site in the country, the Passaic River, which was poisoned by dioxin, which is the active ingredient in Agent Orange, a Covanta garbage incinerator, which is the largest in the state of New Jersey, Passaic Valley Sewage Commission, which is the largest wastewater treatment plant on the East Coast, and the second largest seaport in the country, in the Port of Newark, which is right. All of this is in our backyard, as well as over 150 brownfield sites and numerous other polluting facilities, 2 natural gas power plants, many waste facilities, including waste transfer facilities, chemical companies, you name it, we have it in our community too. And then Superstorm Sandy, when that happened in 2012, that really opened our eyes to the need to get serious on our work on climate change too. As you see here, there's just so many different impacts too all along our coasts here in the water too, where you didn't have just flooding that destroyed property, including public housing developments and low-income homeowners and low-income tenants, because 78% of our neighborhood and Newark overall are renters too, so it really affected some of the most marginalized folks in Newark, including those who are undocumented, who didn't even want to come out and try to get help from FEMA, because FEMA shares the same Homeland Security logo as ICE. So it was a very challenging issue that we had to work to address. And it also wasn't just flooding that was happening, it was toxic flooding that was coming through these Superfund sites, brownfield sites, active industry too, where you had chemicals mixing with floodwaters and stormwater, and which ends up pouring into people's basements. We also just see flooding during everyday storms too, because of combined sewer overflow. So we see a lot of different flooding in our community. And we know we're going to see moving forward the increased risk of floods coming up, as we see parts of our community that are particularly vulnerable too, as well as with sea level rise as well too. So it was in this context that together we worked with two other community-based organizations, Clean Water Fund and New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, to develop the Newark Resiliency Action Plan. And again, as Corrine talked about earlier, it really looked at adaptation, mitigation, and social cohesion coming together. And I would agree that equity kind of just lays on top of all of this. Equity and justice really cuts through all of this work too. What our process looked like, it really starts with just that neighborhood-based resident engagement and community engagement too. We started with doing surveys, door-to-door surveys and community meetings to really hear what those issues are. And then when residents really understood, like they know what the issues are in their community and they have the solutions for them. So it's really critical to start with the community too. And then you can introduce to them and do education with them on the on resiliency terms and stuff, which folks may not know, but what the actual technical term was, but they understand why it is connected too. So we brought all that information to a citywide multi-sector steering committee to start discussing some potential solutions. And we brought those strategies back to the community and then back to the steering committee to keep tweaking it too till we had our final plan and getting ready to implementation. And then it's that neighborhood-based strategy that really guides the implementation and picks strategies and sees what's going forward. So yeah, just we do a lot of this resiliency planning work, just some different shots of what happened in both the steering committee on the upper left and then in different community meetings on the bottom two pictures too. And really what emerged out of the plan is 5 elements to focus on: minimizing flooding and the amount of toxic residue left behind because of the flooding, reducing temperatures and adapting to heat impacts because of urban heat island effect, then preparing for and responding to extreme weather situations, and really emergencies in general too. Also, we've had to deal with explosions at chemical companies, and we have the risk of explosions from some of the oil trains or bomb trains that happen in communities that these rail lines come right through us too. We're also focused on reducing greenhouse gases, as well as just local air pollution in general, some of those co-pollutants too that really affect us. And then lastly, one of the issues was minimizing blackouts and stopping the use of dirty energy and looking towards energy efficiency and renewable energy alternatives like solar. And to address these elements, we combine policy development at the municipal, state, regional, and federal levels, then really on the ground projects in 3 target wards. One of the 5 wards of Newark, where a different community group led those projects with residents. And then that power building that was discussed earlier, that really resident community empowerment that creates these like long-lasting resident climate justice advocates. So if community groups were to go away, there still would be residents there to fight and keep the fight going. I mean, I always think to myself, my job is to put myself out of a job, make myself unemployed, because residents could pick up the charge and do the work that we're doing. And then, yeah, so just taking action and really having grassroots power too, whether it's challenging a state energy master plan or national movements with the Climate Justice Alliance too, and taking part in actions in both the 2014 and 2017 marches too. So very critical stuff for us. Green infrastructure has really emerged as a preferred community solution to addressing flooding, because it has so many other benefits like reducing urban heat island effect and improving air quality too. Riverfront Park, which now exists, and it really exists after 25 years of community-led advocacy and planning, fundraising too to get it built, where beforehand you had shipping containers literally blocking residents' views of the river, and now you have this great green space too. And that acted as a resiliency mechanism that we got to work on too. So we saw that during Sandy too, that where there was no park, there was flooding. And when the park happened, it served as a buffer, a green buffer too, which was exciting. And since Sandy, we've been expanding that Riverfront Park to protect more of our community, which is a great solution rather than seawalls that all too often Army Corps of Engineers or other government entities look to put up, which may protect an individual property, but will make flooding worse on other sides of it too. We're still looking to implement our plan too with more green corridors and green infrastructure, as well as really creating demonstration green districts too that combine new affordable homes, more green spaces, looking at turning schoolyards into green playgrounds, etc. And we keep our education going too, to get youth and get adults of all ages involved in this work. This also includes workforce development, where we are piloting a green infrastructure installation and maintenance training program that will get local residents certified by a national green infrastructure certification program, and allow them to be the ones getting hired to do this too. And we know there's going to be billions of dollars spent in our state in the next several years too. So we want to make sure that local residents get a share of that too. And then again, it's critical to think intersectionally about this work too. As I mentioned, gentrification is hitting our market, coming out from Penn Station throughout the neighborhood, as well as into downtown Newark as well too. When that park opened up, then the very next year, the Housing Authority attempted to shut down and demolish a public housing development right next door. Thankfully, residents stood up with our support, and they stopped that closing of that park. So these connections are very real. Like, as you're building climate resilience and building new green spaces, et cetera, making communities better, it puts immense pressure on existing residents and may lead to displacement. So we really focus on development without displacement and pushing for ensuring that residents can stay in their communities as they improve too, whether it's through rent control, right to council legislation, inclusionary zoning, low-income housing preservation, and creating new housing through a community land trust. It's really important to our work. Yeah, that's about it. There you have my contact information. If you want to reach out to me later, feel free to do so. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Deanna, are you still there?
My apologies. Drew, one of the questions that came up is, what were the on-the-ground projects that you referenced, and how were they funded?
There was a lot of it. They were some of the green infrastructure and tree planting projects, and it was just going out and doing fundraising, whether from government sources or from private foundations, etc. Yeah.
All right. Okay, and Corrine, and can you say a little bit about the peer network that you are that you guys manage through the Adaptation Association? Are NGOs members of that network? I'm thinking of the 40% of the folks who on the front end of the webinar said they had no community engagement in any adaptation initiative and are trying to spearhead those in their own community. Is there room for them? Is there a role for their participation in that network?
Yes, so we actually had our first network gathering at the end of December to beginning of March. It ran through. It was a multi-day gathering this year here in the Bay Area. We're kind of some of the founding members, which are we actually do have founding members that reflect each of the different categories of the NACRP. So if you'll remember, like, partners, which are, again, like you said, government agencies, institutions like educational institutions, philanthropy, and then we had actual facilitators, and then NGOs and grassroots organizations, which you'll see kind of like highlighted in the framework. And so a lot of those folks are either founding members or kind of our highlights reflective of the work. And so we gathered to kind of get priorities, and we're in a moment now where we are continuing to build out the network so that it can, again, provide resources such as this, and really provide a service much like, any kind of network that is heavily government can actually service everyone in a comprehensive way. So right now we're still building it because we just had our gathering this year.
Great. Thank you, Corrine. So within the Urban Waters Learning Network, as I mentioned earlier, we are doing this webinar series and have been uploading a number of resources onto our website. We do have in mind as well, if there's interest among members of the network, to create some sort of task group focused on resilience, community and climate resilience planning and mitigation, whether it's to provide peer-to-peer support or think about what are some gaps in understanding that we could jointly work to fill and to fund collaboratively. So please, if you're a member of the Learning Network, keep that in mind and let us know if that is something that might be of interest to you. Thank you again, Corrine and Drew. Really appreciate your presentations today and the resources that you've shared. Again, everybody, in the handout section, you'll see the framework that Corrine referenced in her presentation. I also want to highlight a couple of other resources that are available on our resource toolbox at urbanwaterslearningnetwork.org. And there's two guides in particular. One on the left side is by the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which follows on this theme of equitable, community-driven planning. It is written more for an audience of municipal government staff. So if you have relationships with local government officials and are trying to move those agencies along to be more inclusive and equitable in their planning processes, that could be a guide that you might want to share with them, or even read yourself and look at some of the different arguments it makes for the value of taking that approach. On the right, you'll see a guide that just was published in the last month and a half, and it is by the NAACP. It is an extensive resources. It's a toolkit, really, with a whole lot of tools within it. The whole thing is about 500 pages long, but it includes really a broad focus on, different aspects of community resilience, and has tools on economic justice, emergency management, food systems, housing, etc. So there's quite a bit in there. It's an amazing resource that just came out, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. Again, under the resource box, you'll find those and a lot more, including project design to build resilience and case studies of those, blog posts on related topics, etc. So just really quickly here, we have a couple of upcoming webinars. that I want to alert you to, and that is coming up on next month, actually, October 9th, is the third webinar in the series. And again, that looks at some of the lessons from Louisiana and thinking about after the storm, equitable recovery, what happens after the storm. And then related to some of the themes that Drew just mentioned, we have a session coming up in a couple of weeks on the 26th, looking at the topic of equitable development and gentrification as part of a different series that we are offering on those topics. And so that is anti-displacement strategies, environmental restoration meet affordable housing. So take a look at that as well. I've just, Corrine, I know you're adding that, yes, that's true. The NAACP resource I just shared makes broad reference to the framework that Corrine was sharing today, and NAACP is a founding member of the Climate Resilience Practitioners Group. So yes, thank you for that clarity. I want to make sure we give due notice to the fact that your framework really has been spurring a whole lot of conversation around equitable climate resilience. Absolutely. So finally, again, I just want to thank all of you for joining today. Again, Diana Toledo here at River Network. My counterpart at Groundwork USA is Maria Brodin. If you're interested in hearing about this or nudging us to prepare other resources or webinars on topics related to climate resilience, please reach out to us. And if you're not already a member of the Learning Network and would like to learn more about it or join us, you can reach out to us as well. So again, I'm just going to close it up just to say in a couple of hours, you'll receive an automated email. It will include a link. I'll include the link to the video that we weren't able to call up during today's session. It'll include the webinar recording and it'll include a link to the ever important evaluation form. If you might take just 1 minute to give us some feedback on today's session, we'd greatly appreciate it. So with that, I'm going to close it up. I hope to see many of you at one of these upcoming sessions. And again, Corrine, Drew, and Renee, who helped behind the scenes put this session together, thank you so much. And both of you have a great afternoon. Goodbye, everybody.